We'll start with an easy one. How do you define the self?
How do I define the self? The longer you work on a question like that, the less prepared you are to give an answer. I tend to make the distinction that I did in a talk I gave earlier today, using classical Indian thought, and say, well, actually, there are two different things going on when we talk about the self. One is, in the classical Indian context, the self is actually the word that you would use for a very specific idea. The Sanskrit word for it is Atman. And that really is about whether there is a diachronic unity across time, to a locus of consciousness, a capacity to have a perspective. So a debate that happens between Buddhist and Hindu philosophers is whether the moment of consciousness at any moment from which you look out to the world, there is an awareness that things are happening, the very act of perception, so forth, whether that is something that changes from moment to moment, or is it something that is unified, it's a particular unitary entity across time. So if I were to believe in a self, it would be that that perspective of consciousness from which all else flows is something that is the same from moment to moment across a life. And indeed, as the classical Hindu philosophers would have said, across different lives. So for me, that is actually an interesting heuristic. It's a way of thinking about what best explains the possibility of experience. And I therefore have a very much a philosopher's view of it. I don't particularly see that as something that I would want to have a particular line on. But very often in ordinary English, when we talk about ourselves, we're really talking about something that, again, the Sanskrit philosophers would have called the person. That is to say, the one who has a particular kind of identity, who has memories, has particular kinds of psychological dispositions, who has relationships from birth through life, who has duties, who has particular kinds of capacities or incapacities. All of those things richly constitute who we take ourselves to be. So when you ask, who are you, I myself think, etc., we're really talking about this very rich and extended notion of who we are. I think that there is no debate philosophically that there is such a thing about human beings, that as persons, we have this rich psychology. So then the question becomes, and was both common in ancient India and has become so in modern Western philosophy in the last 40, 50 years, what happens if some of the structural features of your personal identity are pulled apart? For example, with amnesia, or with, more exaggeratedly through science fiction, suppose you had memories transplanted to you. So then we start having boundary cases. And of course, there is a rich literature in psychiatry and about disorders of the self, as it is called there, which is really about the coherence and continuity of our personhood. And I think that we have two options there. Either we go down the way of saying that these kinds of undoubted sort of psychotic possibilities that human beings encounter, and the thought experiments that allow us to think of how our personhood might be twisted and stretched and sometimes broken, either that suggests that we have a very fragile view of who we are. It's completely contingent on the ways in which our lives turn out, things beyond us, the kind of traumas that might be inflicted on us, the pains and suffering we might have to endure, as well as the kinds of things that might happen to bits of our brain. So it's very fragile. Or you can say, Yes, of course, that there's that fragility, but there is, so long as there is this underlying self, this continuity of perspective, of consciousness, then there is something which is remarkably tenacious throughout our lives, even if we forget massively, even if our life course has changed, even if we completely have to reconsider who we are in terms of our relationships, or who we were born to, or who we love, and so forth. There is this something stronger, something that persists, as I said, tenaciously through life. And I think it is really a matter of inclination whether we want to think about this very changeable, mutable personhood that we occupy across life as very fragile in itself, or as something that points to something much more tenacious, something much more remarkable and continuous.
Our ideas of the self vary between different cultures. They also vary across time. You know, you could make a distinction between the pre-modern self and the modern self. Why is it so plastic? Why is our idea of the self something that's continually being remodeled or affected by environmental factors?
Well, yes, concepts of self in this larger sense, of course, occur across time. They vary. They're also contextualized differently. So it might be this a sense that when we talk about what has happened with the modern self, we're not really talking about the phenomenology, the interior subjectivity of people. You know, it's not as if people across time, at all times, perhaps going back to even earlier hominid species, it's not as if they didn't have thoughts that they kept to themselves, schemes that they had, emotions they tried to control, expressions they wanted to convey or hide. So there are things which are simply not about variation. So when we talk about a modern self, we're really talking about a way of conceptualizing the human person in the context of particular operations of power, whether it be money, or whether it be social hierarchies, or whether it be larger structures within which we work, and so forth. So when we talk about a particular self or a non-self, whether it's chronologically specific or whether it's culturally variable, we need to ask ourselves, what is the context within which we are talking about these variations? So some things, it seems as if evolutionarily there is certain kinds of continuities which alone explain why human beings have asked these questions about who we are, as far as we can make out throughout history in different ways, whether it is in classical Sanskrit texts, or whether it is in Egyptian hieroglyphics, whether it's in different religious traditions. People have asked these kinds of questions, which we can see in the art, in not only in the literature and the philosophical texts, but in art and in ritual and in the construction of things like mausoleums and how we center ourselves in urban planning. So it's clear that human beings part of what constitutes the reflexivity of human beings is the capacity to ask who we are. And that's relatively unchanging. If you then go back to what I said earlier, that even as soon as we ask a question about, is there something like a modern self, we're immediately saying, we are not talking about the metaphysics of the self, we are not talking about necessarily the phenomenological capacities, but we are talking about a particular socio-political self. As soon as we say things like that, we have in effect an answer as to why our narratives of the self are so mutable, so variable across time and across cultures, which is that it is the context of our inquiry into who we are. It's the purposes for which we inquire who we are. It is the way we narrate and communicate who we are to each other that determines a particular local answer. So if there is anything unchanging about the self, it is the human capacity to ask about the self. But every answer you give is going to be embedded and contextualized and therefore local. And it seems as if evolutionarily we have we have evolved to have an adaptive concept of the self. So, for example, if you look at the Buddha, he says there is no self in the context of in the context of saying there isn't a diachronically continuous unitary being that generates all states of consciousness. Obviously, if we are going to shift the concept of no self to modern psychology, you're going to say people who lack a sense of self are in conditions of psychiatric breakdown. So the Buddha wasn't saying, let's embark on a program of psychiatric breakdown. He was talking about the non-self in a particular context of responding to the conditions of suffering that he saw. So he said, our suffering comes from a habit of clinging to things, and we cling to things because we have an overdeveloped sense of who we are, such that we justify to ourselves what we want and what we don't want. And when we don't get it, as invariably in life we don't, you have dissatisfaction, and the dissatisfaction generates more kinds of actions which only deepen this desire. And that's what suffering is. In that context, to say, therefore, let go of who you think you are, therefore don't abide by a sense of self, is very different from how a psychiatrist might say somebody has a breakdown in their sense of self, they don't have continuous narratives anymore, they don't have agency, they don't have capacities to function in life. The Buddha wasn't saying that. So you can almost trivialize the deep puzzlement about why we have so many different, changing ideas of self by saying it's all about the context and the motivation under which we develop those ideas. And that, I think, is perhaps one of the sort of really deep evolutionary advantages that human beings have been able to develop right since perhaps even pre-Homo sapiens, because it is what has allowed us to constantly locate ourselves in relation to an endless number of environmental contexts and factors.
Fascinating. And one of those contexts and factors, one of the most influential, is probably religion and how religion influences the self. I was wondering if you could talk in a bit more detail about that.
So every religion is going to have some sense of how it's talking about the core of the human being, the essence of the human being, however you want to call it. Without that, even say a religious tradition which emphasizes performativity, ritual action, social interaction, political order, even those kinds of traditions have to say who does these things. If you are to obey, who is it who obeys? If we are to act, who is it who is acting? Why does the actor need to act that way or ought to act that way? So if you look at the larger structures of all these religious traditions, they are trying to give an explanation for our location within a cosmos and to give us a particular kind of teleology, a direction, a goal towards which human beings have to go. But in order to do that, they have to tell those who are going to follow them, who are going to adhere to them, to those doctrines, who we are, such that we are capable of meditation, we are capable of worship, we are capable of prayer, we are capable of being open to the Spirit of God coming into us. All these kinds, whatever it is that traditions say about what reality is, it is about our relationship to reality. It is not akin to simply saying we are figuring out how black holes are formed, even though it has absolutely no bearing on our lives. Religion isn't like that. Religion doesn't try to give a narrative which has no bearing on us. As soon as it has a bearing on us, religion has to explain who we are such that that can be a bearing on us. That's why accounts of who we are central to religious traditions.
my line of work's in cancer. I talk to people who have had or have loved someone with cancer, and I work with them to turn their experience into narratives and stories that they can share. Cancer places and not just cancer, but terminal illness and significant illness places a real strain on people's sense of self. I think it's a real challenge to the identity that people have. I don't know. I may be barking up the wrong tree here, but I'd be interested to hear you talk about illness and the self.
So, what is the relationship people have with themselves as they face serious and especially terminal illness? There we are caught in, I think, a profound dilemma. The more robust the sense of who you are, perhaps your religious identity, perhaps your conviction in an afterlife, perhaps your awareness of what kind of actions have led you to this point, such that you might be prepared for death. Whatever that account, the stronger you have a sense of self, of yourself, the greater the challenge you seem to face about its extinction. On the other hand, going towards death without being too worried about what extinction is, expecting that you are simply going to cease because you do not have a close grasp on who you are, might seem as if it is therapeutically preferable, but it could have been arrived at only if you had had a life in which you had an insecure grasp of yourself. And that leads to all kinds of problems in relating to people, in directing your life, and so forth. So there is this sense that the condition of a good life makes a good death more difficult. What might seem to make a good death easier is incompatible with most of what we think is a good life. So the transition is somehow to arrive at the threshold of death with a robust sense of who we are and what we have done and how we have constituted ourselves up to this point. But at that point, in confronting the immediate inevitability rather than the long-term inevitability that we all have, in confronting the imminent inevitability of death, to somehow transform that robust grasp we have on who we are into one that is more comfortable with letting go. And I think that move perhaps psychologically comes perhaps easier to some people than others, which is why it seems as if you look at people's lives and you might not necessarily find somebody having lived a life of sufficient reflexive discipline. You just find some people more at ease with the death coming, and others who find it much more terrifying. I think part of that is simply to do with whether people are so constituted that they can make that transition from having a robust sense of themselves to nevertheless feeling that that sense of self can be let go of. If it is not possible, there are some people who might be inclined to train themselves to being at ease with letting go. But that could be actually terribly dangerous and painful for others for whom that inclination isn't there. That way of confronting the letting go of oneself at the prospect of death isn't what comes naturally. And at that point, we have absolutely nothing to do except to be with them through that inevitable point of extinction towards which they fearfully travel. And then there is only sympathy, no therapy.
Where do you see our ideas of self, or our idea of self, going?
I'm not sure whether the novelty of history at this point is sufficient to make me expect that there is anything predictable about changes in the ways people think of themselves, or narratives about how people ought to think of themselves changes. 2-3 reasons for that. One is that, of course, every generation in every culture thinks of itself by definition as living in unprecedented time, and they're literally right. So that has always been the case. So the novelty and the complexity that we look at will not be very different in phenomenological terms, how we feel, than how the Aztecs might have felt in the 14th century, or how the people of Great Zimbabwe might have felt in the 10th century, and so forth and so on. So I think that to some extent we might I don't think that anything that we are, however complex technologically we are at the moment, the experience of unprecedentedness is there all the time. And so people are going to be no different, I think, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now than they were between 3,500 BCE and 3,200 BCE. The other thing is really my going back to this point that I think that adaptive narratives of the sense of oneself is, I think, a fundamental feature of human evolution. So if you're going to be thinking in evolutionary time, then although we have no idea what happens to Homo sapiens, whether it's become so supremely adapted that environments are adapting to it rather than it adapting to environments, even if you think of it that way, if there are going to be changes in this feature of what I've been arguing is constitutive of Homo sapiens, which is these constantly adaptive senses of self, then that's just going to carry on as it always has. So we have a much, much deeper question. Is this the end of Homo sapiens? Have we got anywhere else to go? Might there be a post-human future? And therefore, might there be different evolutionary adaptations? Perhaps there might be a way in which the environment in which that species functions is such that having one monotonic, robust account of self for all occasions becomes the adaptively efficient, natural selection. Unlike with us, where adaptability seemed to have been that process that has helped us the most. And then finally, I think we have another reason why I think it becomes very difficult to say, are we going to change? Which is that, yes, there is greater interconnectivity. So yes, there is less of a sense of we alone possess an account. These days, you can bust that by just going online and pointing to some article and saying, look, this is what we know. We have the evidence for how the Sumerians were thinking about it. So it's not something that the French invented in the 16th century, something like that. Yes, so we do have a greater flow. Now, what I'm genuinely unsure of is whether this particular unprecedentedness, that connectivity that you were talking about, whether that unprecedented circulation of both in terms of quantity and the number of ideas, but also the speed and thoroughness with which ideas circulate around the world, that is unprecedented. And if all the time we are talking and we're confronted with how radically different accounts of who we are, our senses of self, come up to our knowledge, is that going to make a difference? Is it for the first time in history going to make a difference that being able to look at and simultaneously entertain 20, 25, 30, however many different accounts of who we are, is that going to make a difference? Is there going to be a convergence? I think we are at a point where convergence doesn't look possible because of the fact that the global interconnections is actually leading to an explosion of new ideas rather than an agreement on a particular idea. But who knows, perhaps in 50 years' time or 100 years' time, there might be convergence towards some rather than other narratives of who we are, but I couldn't possibly predict that.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.